the Nuclear Energy Agency for the OECD. We sent around his CV, which is long and illustrious. I think everybody in the room is probably fairly familiar. But we appreciate you coming and joining us. We gave you a little bit of background, but VNECA has been around for about 5 years, brings together the interested parties, I would say, for the nuclear energy industry, academia in Virginia. There's both the authority here, which meets quarterly, and then the VNEC board, which is kind of a subgroup that April, as I said, is the executive director. But we thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours. I'll drive your presentation. Just give me a high sign.
Is there a way I can do it? Maybe.
I don't know if we don't have a.
You know, maybe we could just switch.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Thank you for having me. I've heard about this group. At first, let me say, for those of you who didn't hear me say it earlier, Sama sends her warm regards. She started with us last Friday and is now in fire hose mode, just learning about what we're doing, what her responsibilities are going to be. And I gave her a big mind dump the first day she was there. I'm sure she's thinking, oh my God, what have I got myself into? But she looks like she can be a lot of fun to work with. And she's already giving me some good thoughts. What I think I'll do today, first, and also I'll mention that Janet Magwood, my spousal unit, is here. She also drove down. Janet is, what do you call yourself? What is your title?
Research staff member.
Research staff member with the Institute for Defense Analysis, so a Virginia-based organization, and she's taken the day off to come down and hear. I think it's the first time you heard me give a presentation about the NEA. So
that's not true.
Really?
No, but that's okay. Our anniversary is July 7th. July
9th. And what most of you are new to me, Colleen, Jean, and Dave and I have known each other for quite a few years. And I wanted to just sort of note that when a long time ago we had a period of time when I was at the Department of Energy where literally even saying how about building a nuclear power plant to a U.S. utility would lead to sort of a no, don't say that to us, because people just didn't want to hear it. And it was a point where the only utility executive that had an actual conversation with us was Dave. And I remember Dave and I were walking around Washington one day. I think we were up on Capitol Hill for some reason. And we started talking about what needed to be done. How do we get from here to there? And that seems like a long time ago. Yeah, that led to MP 2010, which proved to be a pretty successful program, and led toward the projects we did get underway today. But as you know, the situation keeps changing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I'm going to talk a bit about the NEA, because I'm sure most of you aren't very familiar with the NEA, because the NEA operates almost exclusively in the governmental realm. The NEA is 33 countries right now. We've most recently added Argentina and Romania as member countries of the NEA. And put simply, our job is to bring countries together to solve interesting problems. We have a lot of structures, standing technical committees, which I'll give you a little bit more detail about in a moment, where we bring experts from around the world to do what I hope is practical, substantive work in trying to solve those problems. We also run international projects. Again, I'll talk about that in a bit. It's one of our sort of secret superpowers, because we can form an international project with pretty much anybody on anything. Our legal authority to do that is very broad, and that's something we intend to use a lot more as time goes on, particularly because of some of the challenges we face today. The mechanism we mostly use is to issue authoritative reports on a variety of subjects. We also, of course, do common positions and best practices. When people often ask us what is the difference between what the NEA does and what the IAEA does, I think the biggest difference is that the IAEA is a global organization, really has to have a framework that incorporates not just France, Japan, and the United States, but also Jordan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, right? So they have to be able to not necessarily set the high bar, but to make sure that the floor is clear. And so a lot of their activities are to set standards and to make sure that everyone is at least meeting those standards. Where what we try to do is we try to go beyond the standards and try to exchange information on important practices that make nuclear operations safer, more effective, and we also look at the longer-term future. So those are all the flags of all the countries. And as I mentioned, we operate a lot of our backbone is through these standing committees. And each of these committees has 30-odd member country representatives who have been appointed by their countries to sit on these committees. And the Committee on Nuclear Regulatory Activities, for example, as of right now is chaired by Victor McCree, who is the EBO of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's stepping down because he's retiring at the end of this month. Unfortunately, people do retire, I guess, don't they? CS&I is chaired by the head of IRSN of France, which is the TSO for the French nuclear regulator, RWMC. I mean, you can see what these committees do with rapid waste. CRPPH is chaired by someone from the EPA, a guy named Mike Boyd. Nuclear Law Committee, NDC. This committee is with the long name. It's called Nuclear Development Committee. Its job is to kind of look at the technology and economic issues associated with nuclear. This is the area that SAMA will be responsible for. Nuclear Science Committee is chaired by John Hersig, who is with the Department of Energy. And we also have this management board for the data bank. And the data bank is this collection of computer programs that we use to analyze severe accidents and other things. And there's like a library of exchange that takes place with that. And also nuclear data, cross sections and things like that. So this is sort of the backbone of what we do. And each one of these committees has a very comprehensive substructure. Before I do that, we also added a new committee. You can imagine on decommissioning legacy management, this is a big issue for a lot of the member countries. And so we just officially got authorization to form the first new committee in 25 years on this area. So we're going to be staffing that up over the next several months. So we're saying each one of these committees has a substructure. In the case of nuclear science here, you can see there are expert groups. And whereas the committee representatives are all appointed by their governments, usually policy level people from energy ministries or science ministries, these working parties and expert groups pull together practicing scientists who work in these, or engineers who work in specific areas, such as actinide management, for example. We have an expert group in accident-tolerant fuels, which has been very active lately. And you can see just a lot of different activities like this, as well as joint projects on specific areas. And these working groups put together these reports, which are issued on a constant basis. We issued 40 to 50 technical reports a year, all of which are available free of charge on our website. We stopped charging about 5 years ago. So now everything is available. So anything you want to look in the history of the NEA, it's all on the website. You can download it, the PDFs free of charge. We also, in addition to our mainline activities, have these separately funded activities, and these give us some flexibility because these separately funded activities can incorporate non-member countries. For example, we have 3 service organizations that are under our umbrella: Generation for International Forum, where I was the first chair when I was at DOE a million years ago; Multinational Design Evaluation Program, which is a group of regulators that compare notes on state-of-the-art technologies like the Westinghouse AP1000, the Ariba EPR, other technologies, and the regulators get together and they look at they see if they're asking the same questions and getting the same information. They do a lot of exchange with each other to make sure that we're all looking at these technologies the same way. In the International Framework for Energy Cooperation, 65 countries that brings together the highly developed countries with the developing countries, and they work together to solve, we talk about issues like, how do you pay for nuclear power, which is an irritating conversation for everybody to have. We have these major joint projects that cover a wide range of areas. Nuclear safety is a big aspect of this. We have several new joint projects related to the Fukushima Daiichi accident. For example, we have a project called the Benchmark Study on the Accident at Fukushima that is currently looking at all the severe accident analysis codes that are available in the US and Russia, Japan, and France. And we're comparing those codes to each other and also to what we know happened in Fukushima Daiichi to see if there's an agreement. The answer is yes, there's good agreement, so we have some confidence there. So those are the sorts of things that we do. So that's the background on the NEA. So whenever we're talking about nuclear these days, the first thing that people usually ask us about is how does nuclear fit into this whole discussion about climate change that we've gotten into. Obviously in France and in Europe, the COP21 was seen as a tremendous success, much less talked about here in the US, I think, but overseas is a very, very big deal. And countries, at least on a political level, have made these commitments that they're going to move down this path to limit CO2 emissions. And many countries, including big countries like India and China, have indicated that nuclear is going to be a big part of their strategies. As we talk to a lot of countries, Eastern European countries, countries in Latin America, countries in the Middle East, they point to nuclear as a big part of the solution. As I'll talk about in just a minute, and we look at sort of the traditional developed countries, the nuclear conversation is a lot more complicated. However, we do see that as you look around these developed countries, there are some differences in what's happened in the last few years, which are very instructive. As you can see in this chart, you look at the blue line, that's the U.S. Emissions for energy production in the U.S. have been trending down steadily. And as Dave and Jean will testify, that's almost entirely due to gas. And that's because we're turning off coal plants, we're turning on gas plants. And this is really just still switching from coal to gas. Europe has been seeing a very similar type of trend downwards. A whole lot of reasons for that. Deindustrialization is a big part of it, but also very high efficiency standards, deployment of more renewables. There's a lot of different factors leading to this. So those are relatively positive stories if you're worried about this. Germany is a very interesting case. In this chart, you see that Germany is kind of plateaued a little bit. It shows a dip in this year, but we think it's gone back up in more recent data. Because as they've begun to back off of nuclear and back off and activate more renewables, they actually do have a lot of gas turbines spinning in the background, creating a lot of CO2. So their emissions actually have not gone down as much as one might think. The very interesting cases here are the last two. The red line is Japan. As you see, after Fukushima Daiichi, all the nuclear plants were shut down. They began importing LNG. Emissions spike up. And this is a big issue for the Japanese because they have now committed at the very highest level that they will reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. And I just was in Japan a couple of weeks ago, and I asked, well, how are you going to do that? And they said, we have no idea. And that leads to some other conversations, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. And of course, the case that is also quite interesting is the green line, which is France, which we look at just the energy infrastructure. France today already meets COP21 objectives, and there's not a lot of countries that can say that. But if you listen to radio and read newspapers in France, you see constant criticism from the public and from a lot of policymakers that France is basically behind the curve. They are not doing enough to deal with climate change. They aren't deploying enough wind and not doing enough solar, and this is horrible because the French should be leading. Instead, they're dragging everyone else down. And the nuclear people in France is always like, we don't understand. Why don't people see that we actually already are where we need to be? And instead of celebrating that, France has made a political decision to begin backing off their commitment to nuclear from 78% today, 78% electricity, down to 50%. And when you say to them, well, if you look at cases around the world, what that tells you, what that does is it means your emissions are going to go up, they're going to go down. They just don't tell us that. So it's a very complicated situation. Overall, and we work with an organization called the International Energy Agency. It looks at all forms of energy and does a lot of economic analysis. And they looked at how do you answer the question, well, if we actually are successful, COP21 does everything it's supposed to be, where should the energy come from? And you can see in this chart, the answer is it comes from pretty much everywhere, and you need a lot of everything. So this is done in a background where energy efficiency globally increases, I think, 35%, but you need a lot of wind, you need a lot of solar, you need carbon sequestration, which is another conversation. But you also need a pretty significant increase in nuclear globally. This is the equivalent of about 2.5 times more nuclear than we have today in order to try to meet these. And I think is always certainly the case when you look at projections like this. You should never take them at face value. I think whenever you see these long-term projections, they're almost invariably wrong. But what this does show you is that if you say, for example, well, we don't want nuclear in this mix, that means everything else has got to grow that much more, and it's already expanding quite dramatically. And I think if you're concerned about climate change, what this shows you is that no matter what we do, this is going to be very, very difficult to achieve, if not impossible. So where does nuclear fit in this? And this is, I'll show you some analysis from various NEA reports as we go through this. What we often do when we point to comparing cost of different energy technology, we look at LCOE. That's the usual measure we look at. And when you look at LCOE, especially if you're looking at the long-term investment in nuclear power plant at 40 to 60 years, nuclear still looks pretty good in our analysis. It still comes in pretty competitively with coal, with combined cycle, and is actually cheaper than offshore wind, sort of competitive with onshore wind, and certainly cheaper than solar when you look at that long-term investment. But what we find, though, is two things. First, nuclear costs keep going up, and these costs, I think, reflect nuclear construction costs of about $6,000 to $8,000 per installed kilowatt. And as you know, when we actually do the projects, they tend to end up more than that. And we've done studies on that as well, and found that a big part of the problem is our supply chains are very weak in countries like the United States and France, and increasingly in Japan. Whereas they have very healthy supply chains in countries like Korea and Russia, and therefore they're able to meet their cost targets much more effectively than we are. But when you look at this, you also recognize that renewable costs keep coming down quite significantly over time. Nuclear costs are going up, and so this picture comes off a little bit optimistic. But if you look at it another way, it's actually not that optimistic. If you look at it another way, in terms of construction costs, you can see nuclear, as it always has been, is extremely high. And what we're seeing in our analysis is that this construction cost is actually overwhelming whatever benefits you have over the long term, because people just don't make decisions that way. No one goes, I imagine it's hard for people at the Dominion to go to the board and say, over 80 years, this is going to be a fantastic investment. But if it's going to, if you put your company at risk just in the size of the investment up front, it's a showstopper. And what we're seeing is that people are beginning to turn off of the idea of using nuclear in many, many countries because of these very, very high construction costs, especially with the huge uncertainties. In the UK, we have learned that they were planning to build 2 ABWR reactors. David. Oh yeah. And the cost of construction is projected to be about 17 billion pounds, which is $25 billion, something in that neighborhood, which is outrageously expensive. And the only way the project is going to go forward is if the UK government invests £5 billion directly. Without that investment, the project doesn't happen. And even with that, they have to set a price for electricity from that ratepayers will have to pay that will be, I can't make the translation in my head, 75 pounds per megawatt. And that's, it's a high price. So politically, it's becoming clear that even countries that want to build nuclear power plants are running into this wall, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And according to the analysis that we've done at the NEA, to the degree, and then I'll sort of back off and talk about this a bit. To the degree that renewables come online, because of these high costs, nuclear loses. So the first column shows a large carbon price of, say, I think in this analysis it was $60 per ton of carbon, if I remember correctly, and that pushes coal and even suppresses gas to some degree. And if there's no other restrictions, then nuclear kind of takes over. So that's the big red. But then if you say, well, what if we introduce more and more renewables, and that's the green bars, you see every time you bring renewables on, nuclear loses. You displace nuclear every single time. Now in this analysis, it goes down to 75% renewable energy. We actually don't think that's practical. There's some people that think you can get up that high, We don't see it really. Our analysis shows, and others' analysis shows that 40 to 50 is probably more realistic, but even that has some challenges. But what this shows you is that the long-term future for nuclear is really in question, just because of these very high costs. Now, that said, and this is a new report that has come out on the full cost of generating electricity, which is on our website. You might want to download this. We think that you really do have to look at the full cost, and that when countries are making decisions about what to build, that they are looking at isolated costs. So you mostly look at plant level costs. And if you compare the plant level costs of, say, a solar facility versus a nuclear facility, the nuclear facility looks very expensive. But if you start to include grid level costs like transmission, such as backup generation, storage, whatever else is necessary, that changes the cost picture. And we also think, and this gets to a very old conversation about externalities, we also think you ought to look at these external costs. And what we found is these external costs are difficult to calculate, but they are possible. And some people have already done it. This is a study that was done in France some time ago. They looked at different energy technologies and tried to establish these social costs, which means people dying from lung disease, accidents, whatever else. You add it all up, nuclear looks pretty good. Nuclear costs come in very, very competitive compared certainly to fossil fuels, and actually look pretty comparable to most of the renewables. So we can do these calculations, and we think that they ought to be reflected in these decisions that are being made around the world. But the reality is that the markets, as they function today, don't recognize the advantages of nuclear power facility. For example, something as simple as reliability is something that we have not figured out how to quantify and how to remunerate on electricity prices. So therefore, the fact that utilities around the world see their nuclear plants as assets in terms of flexibility and reliability just doesn't count. It just doesn't show up anywhere. And when we try to evaluate it, we're not successful. So the markets are not functioning very well. And in many parts of the world, the markets actually, quite frankly, are broken. Because if you have markets where electricity prices are often zero or negative prices, that's not a market anymore. That's something else. And that's something that we have to take account of. Yes, please.
I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but the cost of human health for solar PV being relatively high and a big chunk of its cost. Can you speak to where that comes from at all? I find that very curious.
Yeah, like this is not our study, so I can't give you a lot on that, but I do know that solar PV does release a lot of heavy metals and radionuclides into the environment. Places where you're mining the rare earths and other materials needed to make these things lead to pollution that can cause cancer. And then I think that this would also try to capture some of the disposal costs, which are almost never talked about.
So it's a
It's
full
life
life
cycle.
Okay,
Full
gotcha.
life cycle. And I don't think anyone's taking full account of the loss of the Reactors and things like that. So so again, but this shows that you can attack these problems. You can approach this and try to get a handle on it. Because if we're going to make these long-term decisions, they ought to be based on full information. And right now, we're not making decisions on full information. We're letting the markets decide. But the markets aren't really deciding anything because the market's broken and dysfunctional, and they are been completely distorted in some places by renewable subsidies, and that's a big issue. Yes.
Why I was listening to the question about the renewables or the solar. How is nuclear waste and storage? I mean, already, even if Yucca was feasible, the federal government's already said that we'll need 2 large repositories. I mean, we're talking about many, many years, but are these analyses really including the mining of uranium and all the different things, as well as in perpetual, forever storage of nuclear waste?
Yeah, we try to incorporate all the full life cycle.
And that is in this study up here, or
Yeah,
these
this
slides?
is not our study, so I'm not going to. I don't know exactly what details they have in this study, but I think, but from my understanding of it, yes, they did try to capture that.
And where can I find that information?
I will have to get back to you on this particular study. Let me see if I can find that study and get it back to you.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I would say, in most countries, in fact all countries we work with, nuclear waste is already captured in the prices. It's already money that gets set aside to deal with decommissioning the nuclear power plants, with disposing of nuclear waste, while recognizing at the same time that we have not, in the United States, gotten to the final piece of that, which is the repository we will place this. I think it's going to change in the future. There are countries in Europe, particularly Finland, that we expect will actually be successful in the mid-2020s to deploy a deep geological repository. And when that's done, I think that will sort of put the reality to the situation that we do know how to handle nuclear waste. It does not have to be stored forever. It's not a technical issue, it's a political problem. And when you carve through the political problem, as the Finns have been able to do, you'll be able to dispose of this material safely and effectively. And I think that's going to be shown.
Well, that sounds good, Mr. Magwood, but we had the accident at WIP, and we have the ongoing huge problem at Hanford. It's more than just a political problem, and
There will be time for public comment at the end, so.
Okay, well,
Okay, thank you.
I'll be happy to talk about that. And one thing I would say about the issues you've mentioned is in no case were any of those WIP, Hanford, those were not under independent regulatory oversight. That's something that I think is important to recognize.
Fukushima.
The DOE facility, WIP, was overseen by DOE, and we've looked at that accident and analyzed it. And if it were an NRC regulated facility, that would never have happened. It simply wouldn't have happened, in my view. But we can get back to that. So just a few key observations. So renewables are going to be deployed. I don't think there's any question we're going to see a lot of renewables, wind and solar, are going to be deployed around the world, and they're going to alter the markets. That's just a reality of where things are going. Natural gas in many parts of the world, particularly North America, are bringing electricity prices down. And unless one of two things have to happen for nuclear to play a role in the future. One way is for policymakers to say that that the contribution of nuclear is so important that we have to have special treatment for nuclear in the markets to provide incentives to continue to operate the plants, or a more global solution like heavy carbon taxes, which would give nuclear clearly advantage over gas and other fossil fuels. But those, I think, are extremely difficult. Those are big political decisions that we have not seen countries really take. So I think that one other aspect we have to look at is the technology itself. And that's something that we have not been very good at in the last several decades. Nuclear technology has not shown, reflected the innovation that one would expect of a high technology industry over the years. I was talking to someone recently, and we were saying if you had the crews, operations and maintenance crews of a nuclear power plant that retired in 1978, brought them back today, they could pretty much pick up where they left off. I mean, there's not a lot that's changed. There's virtually no other high technology industry you can say that about. And that's a combination of factors. But the truth is, we just simply have not innovated, and I think that's beginning to now bite because the cost structures of nuclear are coming less and less in pace with what the world is. I've spent some time thinking about this in terms of the basic technology we work with, which is light water reactor technology. I'm very optimistic about things like NuScale, but even NuScale comes in at $5,000 per installed kilowatt, which is way off where the market is today. So light water reactor technology itself, while it's very well understood, we know we can build it safely, we know that it's a good technology in terms of baseload power, does it really fit where we are today? And we have these ongoing challenges. I mean, obviously, to build, operate a light water reactor is an expensive undertaking. It takes billions of dollars, it takes huge amounts of material and equipment. It requires a big regulatory oversight infrastructure, and that's just the nature of the technology. Nuclear waste, as this lady was pointing out, is a continuing issue that comes up a lot in public conversations, and the public is still, in many countries, thinks that nuclear is unsafe. If you go into Japan and take polls, The majority of Japanese think nuclear power plants should all be shut down. So this brings back this issue of innovation. We really need to have innovation to make nuclear costs more cost-effective, higher, and more flexible, to find ways to have high safety at lower cost, to deal with the fuel cycle issues and nuclear waste. But as I said just a minute ago, in general, to make sure that nuclear fits in whatever framework is coming in the future. Unfortunately, we're probably in some ways at our weakest point when it comes to innovation. We just don't have the investment and the activity in the nuclear area that we're used to in the technology side. I mentioned Generation 4. This is a chart which has been enduring. It's kind of funny because I did this in back of an envelope a million years ago, and now it's proliferated all over creation. And it's really fun for me when I go to a country and there's some like 30-something PhD who gives me a presentation explaining to me what all these generations were. I got that. But so Generation 4 International Forum has been around for more than about 15 years now, and there's been a lot of work done, a lot of research. There was a Generation 4 conference that was just held with 100 different papers. But despite all that, we've actually done almost nothing. There's lots of research projects, but there's been no actual deployment, no actual demonstration. And there's reasons for that. And the reasons are, go all through these. The reason, I won't go through these in detail, I think you're familiar with this. The infrastructure, we're losing infrastructure, we're losing reactors, we're losing hot cells. And a lot of the infrastructure built in many countries is 40 plus years old and is on its way being phased out. Regulatory challenges are pretty significant. If you want to deploy a new technology nuclear power plant, it ain't easy. That was NRC, and that was, we had these conversations. And I don't think it's because NRC is naturally against new technology. It's just that the amount of evidence you have to bring to the table makes it very formidable to move forward. And I think perhaps in NRC in the U.S. is more conservative than a lot of other regulators on some areas like digital instrumentation systems, for example. But it's also important to point out the regulators don't think their job is to innovate. Their job is to protect public health and safety, so they aren't worried about this. And cost, the cost of developing new technologies is very, very high. As someone who used to run research programs at DOE, I can tell you, you reach this point where you can spend $50 or $100 million a year on some research activity. But in nuclear, unlike every other technology, eventually you have to build something, or it doesn't matter. And when you build something in nuclear, instead of saying 50 or 100 million a year, you say, well, we need maybe 600 or 700 million dollars now, and that wall becomes insurmountable. So this is a big issue. Now this is a chart. The first time I used this was actually at a RIC speech, and I like this chart because it shows something that I think is really kind of remarkable. This is a picture of Glenn Seaborg and James Webb back in 1961. Seaborg obviously was chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Webb was head of NASA. This picture was taken when they came together to sign an agreement to develop space nuclear systems to go explore the planets. And when was the last time we saw leadership in Washington thinking about something so far down the road? These are pretty serious guys who were really putting resources and people to develop these long-range technologies. We just don't do that anymore. We don't have that vision for the long-term future that we did in the past. And when I go to countries, developing countries, and you see people who are working on technologies to make life better, you see that excitement about making this next generation healthier and happier than the previous generation. Go to India, go to Malaysia, and talk to people and see how excited. I remember this lady at an organization called National Cancer Institute, and she was doing using MRI technology and able to diagnose cervical cancer long before it became fatal. She said 10 years ago, women would come to us with cervical cancer, and we would just watch them die. We could do nothing. It's just too late. She said now we screen people and we can cure. And she said it's just so exciting, And that excitement is something we just don't see anymore, and that's something we have to regenerate. At the NEA, we launched something called Nuclear Innovation 2050. And what we were trying to do with this is to define what the high priority technology items might be over the next several years, and how we can get the community together to work on it. And what we did was we pulled together about 100 people from around the world, and they came together and they kind of sketched out what you have here. And I think all these technology areas are very familiar to you. Aging management, decommissioning technologies, advanced manufacturing, hybrid systems, just lots of things, accident-tolerant fuels. So these are things that they've identified, and what we're doing right now is we're focusing right now on advanced fuels. And with advanced fuels, we're trying to find a way to make sure that we can deploy advanced fuels faster and more cost-effectively than we have in the past. I noticed if you go back and you talk to your friends at Framatome about fuels they've developed over the last several decades, it takes 25 years to get new fuel in place. If that's where we are at this point, we're doomed, because we'll never be able to deploy new technology. We have to shorten that cycle. So I'm going to wrap up here. Major questions for the future. Will countries really take action to reduce carbon emissions? I don't know. I really don't. I know they say they will, but I'm not seeing it. And I'm not seeing the political will to do it. I see lots of actions that are taken to give you cover to say we're doing something without actually solving the problem. Is it really possible to have more than 50% penetration of variable renewables with the grid technology we have today? Lots of questions about that. What role will storage play? I heard you talking about storage. I think that's really going to be the most important single energy technology question of the next 20 years. Can we get storage to be cost effective and practical? Because today, despite what you hear, it's just not practical. It just isn't. And unless we have breakthroughs in technology and battery storage, it's not going to be. And will nuclear energy be able to evolve to meet these changing environments? So at the end, so water-cooled reactors, as I pointed out, are a bit of an issue, but they're going to be around for a long time. There's no question about that. SMRs sort of step in the right direction. Things like NuScale can be pretty exciting. But we're going to have to really look at this question about is light water reactor technology where this begins and ends? Should we really be thinking serious about molten salt, high temperature gas reactors, and other technologies? Are there other technologies out there that could have a lower cost structure? And if we don't solve these problems, I think in OECD countries, which means in developed countries, we've already seen the peak of nuclear technology, and it's downhill all the way from there. That doesn't mean that nuclear power disappears overall, because there's very aggressive programs all around the world outside of developed countries, India, China, Latin America, Middle East, Eastern Europe, Russia, very aggressive programs to build nuclear power plants. But we might find that in our countries, U.S., France, Japan, that peak might be behind us. So if we're going to solve those issues, the time is now. We have to start. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we're doing at the NEA is we're convening a group of countries that are going to have a serious conversation at a relatively high level about if we can't do it separately, there's just something we can do together to break through some of these barriers and look at these advanced technologies. And if we don't do that within the next 5 or 10 years, I'm afraid it's going to be too late to do anything about it. I think we're going to be past the point where we can actually develop and deploy these new technologies. And we'll be left in the situation of having to buy all our new technology from the Russians and the Chinese. And if you're comfortable with that, that's okay. But if not, now it's time to take action. That's a picture of our headquarters. We moved there 2 years ago. We're on the Seine River. My office is kind of like right up there in the middle somewhere. So I have a nice balcony. So, yeah,
That glass up at the top of those towers, right?
yeah, those domes are pretty nice. So, yeah, if you're ever in Paris, come by. You can sit on my balcony and have some wine. Yeah.
So, thank you. That was, I think, really good context for what we're dealing with. A lot of your conclusions. One question or thought, wondering if you all are looking at. So, from a supplier developer standpoint, like Framatome, as you talked about the example of advanced fuels, but I think this also more than applies to the next generation of reactors. Especially we're now operating in you can't just sell to one country, right? We're not developing a technology that can only be deployed in the US or only be deployed in Europe. It has to be global in order for the economics to work from a technology development standpoint. But what comes with that is then licensing in every country. And the expense, I mean, I just look at our experience with the EPR here in the US and the amount of money we spend just to get to design certification when we'd already had it certified in Europe. But you had to make change. Anyway, has there been any thought of NEA looking at, maybe in concert with IEA, of maybe a global licensing framework for new technologies? Because I think the regulatory piece that you talked about, while I would never pin any of this there's problems everywhere, there's issues to overcome everywhere, but that regulatory structure can be one of the big hurdles to get over for new technologies, especially.
It's a huge hurdle. If we talk about, let's say you talk about small modular reactors. With small modular reactors, you've got these systems that you're not going to make a huge amount of money on each SMR, right? The profit margin is very, very thin. So the only way you make money is to sell a lot of them. That's what if this works, that's what it's going to look like. And as you pointed out, you have to have access to the market. But the way we do it today, everything happens in series, right? So you put your application in RC, you get your RC license, and then you make enough money to go move on to Canada, and then you do the same thing there, and it starts all over again. And then, everyone understands this won't work. So there are we've gotten some things going that are already quite positive. In the case of NuScale, for example, there's already been some very good bilateral discussions between U.S. NRC and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission about cooperating and trying to leverage what NRC's already done. So that could set a pattern for the future, but that's not really enough. Now, your question is, what about an international licensing framework? I don't think that'll ever happen for the following reason: the regulators are never going to subsidize their responsibilities for public health and safety to international organizations. This is not going to happen. We're not going to do that. But, and this is something we are actively working on. We've been working with 4 governments right now, talking about the idea of, okay, let's say that we're not going to have NEA, for example, give a license to a nuclear technology. No, that's not going to work. But what if we facilitate 3 or 4 countries to do the analysis together, the technical analysis? Basically, in NRC speak, if you had a DCD, a design certification document, that was put together by a group of countries and agreed to by those countries, that's the hard part. That's where the real work happens. And then they can go off and do their normal political processes or public outreach processes, whatever they have to do, the whole hearings or whatever else. But using that one technical document as the basis. That's something that we're actively talking to people about, and there seems to be some confidence that this will work. We've had several pretty detailed meetings to talk about the concept, and we think it can work.
I think that right there could be very significant. Even if you just think about the 2-step licensing process here, if there was a common, and like I said, maybe it's not a full international, but there's select groups of countries or something that could come to some agreement on a common design certification process. That right there, if you only had to go through that as a vendor once, you would, that'd be a big step.
It's not easy for lots of reasons. Some of the frameworks are very different. The one we've had the most trouble with actually is the UK. And the UK's framework is very, very conservative. And when we started looking at things like pressure boundary analyses, they are so far more conservative than everybody else. It's really kind of hard to bring that back together. But maybe you don't have to capture 100% of the analysis. If you get 80% of the analysis, you've still accomplished something. So this is an active thing, but it's never going to be easy.
Are the countries that you're working with all of the developed nuclear
Yes.
countries like the UK? Because it would seem to me it might be easier if you brought in some of the countries that don't have a regulatory system yet and assist them in forming it, so that it conforms with what's already out there.
The big challenge, let me use a specific country, let's say Singapore. So Singapore has aspirations about building SMRs as a possible future, because they have energy issues. They want to reduce their reliance on imported fossil fuels. They want to deal with climate change, and if they could have a very, very safe SMR, that's something they'd like to look at. So let's say that they want to buy a NuScale reactor. which is, which would be 600 to 800 megawatts, it keeps changing. And so how do they license that? I mean, do you go through a 5 to 10 year, $500 million process to license it in Singapore? It makes no sense. First, they don't have the capability, they don't have the technical ability to do that. So how do you, so
I was
that,
thinking closer on the timeline, like for instance, Saudi Arabia.
well, see, here's what, I think what you often find with countries that are developing these frameworks is that they are looking for, they're not going to develop a framework from scratch. Look at UAE, for example. UAE largely adopted the US framework. And then they had to bring people in who understood the framework and try to apply it in the UAE. So these guys aren't writing the framework, they're just adopting what's already there. I shouldn't say just, it's not easy to do that, it's significant. So what we have talked about is get the developed countries to create a licensing framework like I described. And once you have this document, you could very easily apply this in different countries that don't have the complicated frameworks, because you now have the analysis. The analysis is done, and it has international credibility because not one country has agreed to it, but 3 or 4 big countries agreed to it. So no, we have not tried to do this with the developing countries. We don't think they have the acumen, quite frankly, the people to be able to sit and have these conversations, because it gets into details. You have to have experienced people who understand the regulatory analysis and very intimate level, and most of these countries just don't have that.
Yeah, and they are, some of them, like for instance, Saudi Arabia, trying to build that up. Do you see a role for you in helping bring these countries along on all of these aspects?
Whenever people ask that question, I usually send them to Vienna. I mean, that's what the IEA does for them. They bring people up to a standard. And when they graduate from them, they come to us. So, they have to start with that, because we don't do training, we don't do those sorts of things. What we're talking about is particularly this multilateral licensing activity.
They're already up there.
We're way up there, and we had some of the best and brightest people at NRC in some of these meetings, and they're so far ahead where even a lot of our own members are, that the idea of bringing Saudi Arabia to the conversation just wouldn't work.
And I didn't see China a part of your.
China is what we call a strategic partner.
Okay.
And we've actually had some interesting time in China in the last year, because they have largely concluded that they want to be closer to us. I had lunch with a senior Chinese official. He started talking about we were in a dating process, and maybe we're moving towards engagement, and then next year, who knows, maybe we'll pop the question. It's kind of, it was so torturous. And that's something which I personally think is a very good thing. I think that China has so much going on, not just deploying new nuclear power plants, but they're doing a lot of technology work. I think Gene, you mentioned the molten salt reactor experiment at Oak Ridge. They've gotten access to all the information of the molten salt reactor experiment at Oak Ridge, and they're building one. They're going to build one like 2025. They're just going to build it. They're just going to do it. Now, it's not going to work. It's not going to be a practical machine, but they're going to learn a lot doing this. So they're doing more in China than the rest of the world almost put together. So I think they ought to be part of the family. But unfortunately, the political situation is pretty strange right now. Yeah, it's not. So it's not clear to me if they do want to join, whether all our member countries will support them. But from my personal standpoint, I think we should do it.
I have one last question. Nuclear liability in India.
What's your question?
I just threw it out there.
Well, I remember a few years ago, there's all these press releases that came out of the U.S. government in India that they solved the problem. And I remember I called somebody, I won't say which company, and said, "Does this solve the problem?" I said, "Absolutely not."
No.
And nothing's happened. I mean, even though I keep talking to people at the UE to say that they're really optimistic about building plants in India, I don't see it myself. I just think it's too hard. And quite frankly, I'm not sure they really want to do it. I was in India in November, and whenever I brought up, Western technologies, it's kind of like, oh yeah, we do that. The enthusiasm's not there. I think they're very confident in their own indigenous technology. They're building some VBERs now. I'm not sure they go much beyond that. You never can tell. I mean, there might be some big deal cut. Maybe they'll build some AP1000s, but I think that U.S. probably has a lot more ability to sell plants in the Middle East under the right conditions, and also Eastern Europe. I think Poland is a real possibility. I was in Poland not long ago, and I think they'd love to go with U.S. technology. So I think there's still a market out there. It's not a huge market because a lot of these countries need financing that the U.S. simply isn't going to provide. The Russians will build a plant for you for nothing, essentially, and then operate it. We don't do that. And the Koreans, the Koreans are building this plant in the UAE, probably not making money on it. But more importantly, I was in Korea last year, and I talked to the guy who's running the program to train about 500 Koreans to go to the UAE. And I asked, well, how long do you think those people are going to be there? He said, chances are like the plant. And these aren't like laborers, these are nuclear engineers. And so you're talking about operations staff, maintenance staff, all being expatriates. And quite frankly, it's already proven to be a problem. It's already proven to be a problem. The reason they've delayed the start of the UAE reactors is the plant itself is ready to go. They just don't have the people trained yet. And it's hard to do this on an expatriate basis. So that's what they're going to try to do. So it's something we're watching.
Thank you.
So this kind of analysis raises some questions for this group, I guess, along the lines of innovation. But I guess first let me say that recently I was up at GE's Global Research Center in Schenectady looking at their global energy flow models and climate predictions. And it lines up with what you're saying, is that there's absolutely no way to hit 2 degrees by 2050 without nuclear. And even at max solar and max wind deployment, it's just not going to happen. So there's two groups of people that have more or less convinced me that climate change is not a problem. And those two groups of people have something in common. One group of people is the policymakers, through their inaction and lack of understanding of the math of the problem. And the other is the far side of the environmental community that thinks that it can all be done with renewable and solar. And the two things that they have in common are magical thinking. And it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You might as well admit that it's not going to happen. So then you're into how much overshoot do you want to have beyond the 2 degrees. So, but I think for this group here, we could consider incorporating into the mission, how might we go about promoting innovation alongside of the core mission. I was recently with Secretary Moniz about a week ago, former Secretary of Energy, who runs an organization in Washington called Energy Futures Initiative, which is really concerned with climate change and how to go about combating it. And they publish a lot of studies that are available for free on the internet. And Ernie's also on the board of Tri-Alpha. We didn't talk about any of those ventures, but one of the conclusions of one of their recent papers is that we need more innovation at the state level to make progress on climate change. It's that you've got to have innovation in national labs, you've got that, you've got to have innovation in corporate America, but state level innovation and state level supported innovation could be a big factor in the pace at which we make progress towards minimizing emissions.
Well, I mean, the issue is always how do you pay for the innovation?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the big thing. In nuclear, if we were just, Gina was just saying, but in nuclear, if you're deploying new technology, you've got to have access to the order of $2 billion. I mean, ultimately, you can't do this on the cheap. It takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of talent to do it. So you have to have the money, and the markets just don't support those investments on a private sector basis right now. I mean, that's just where we are. And the U.S. government, is I sort of look at my friends at DOE, and I get kind of frustrated because I see they actually get a pretty significant amount of money. They have a lot of money, but they scatter it all over the place. And when you do that, you end up not really advancing anything. So I think if you're serious about solving these issues in the timeframes that the scientists are talking about, having an impact in 2050. You kind of have to have new technology in place by 2030 at the latest, and that's something that's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, I think the 2030 date actually has some more significance, because if you look at that huge gas build that took place, many of those units are being operated in ways they were not originally designed to do. They're cycling a lot more, and they're being run harder than they were intended to run. So in 2030 or so, there's going to be a replacement issue, that many of those units are going to have to be replaced. And so now you're going to have a question, what do you do at that time?
Which units are you talking about?
I'm talking about the combined cycle things that were all built in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, they're going to reach the end of their design life. And so then what? Now you're going to have a replacement issue. And so do you replace them with in-kind stuff again, or do you replace them with something else that is perhaps more in tune with carbon reduction?
I think, building on what Dave was saying too, for our group, state level policy innovation from our perspective, I think is important, because it's not just, so if we look at it just inside the Commonwealth's borders, yes, there's important things, but Dominion's going to 80 years with their, with their plants. The nuclear plants here are going to be around for a while and provide that base of operation here. But it's also, we need to think about, well, how can Virginia also think about their role in influencing the debate in other states too? Because, as plants are forced offline for reasons not operational, that has an impact on the infrastructure. I think, one of the things our folks talk about all the time is innovation doesn't exist if there's not something for folks to be working on right now also. So that, tying it to where do you send engineers on existing operations, and advanced fuels, that's spurred by going into the existing plants, and building the bridge to the next generation as well. So that's something I think we should think about as a group. We may not be looking, we don't need to save the plants in Virginia, but the ones in the other states have a big impact on what happens here as well.
Well, just to comment on that, I mean, I think as you point out, the overall infrastructure in the U.S., and if you look at, and I'm sure David's looked at this a lot pretty carefully, looking at the Vogel and summer experiences, what a lot of people don't realize about that is that when they started building these plants, they were relying on a whole web of suppliers to provide valves, pipes, and everything else on nuclear quality equipment. And all these people had signed up and said, we can do this, and we agree to provide this on this particular basis at this cost. And then when they were asked to deliver, they couldn't do it. And I think we all suspected there was going to be some softness there, but I don't think anybody had any idea how bad it was. And basically what we discovered is that when you can't expect to build a nuclear power plant very easily if you've not done it in 30 years. And so the infrastructure in the U.S. is very, very weak. And that's just the reality. And the only way to fix it is build plants, unfortunately. And what we see happening is that this is likely to continue and accelerate if we aren't building more plants in the very near future. And most unlikely that England's going to start any new plants. So I don't know how you reverse course on that. That's hard to do. So the best you can do is to sort of, if you maintain existing plants, that gives you some framework. If you start doing innovation in those plants, that helps a little bit as well. But the best I think is we're in a university here. I think the best thing to do is to make sure your education basis is as strong as you can make it.
And we've talked to DOE about this as well. But we have to figure out a way to not let we've had the growing pains of the Georgia and South Carolina projects, and we can't let that experience go for nothing. We need to have, so new scale is a great thing to have on the horizon. And we've talked about, other projects that come after, but we need to, there has to be something so that we can at least build on the experience we've had, maintain that infrastructure.
The other problem there is that the design was not complete either.
No,
Started
no.
working on the design and hadn't been finished.
Yeah, we keep learning the same lesson over and over again. We keep doing this to ourselves.
But there's a reason for that, and that is, and it gets back to the money. It's that-
It gets back to money.
you know, that you don't want to spend, you don't want to spend the money to finish the design until you got some revenue coming in.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's-
Well, I mean, we knew better than that, but,
We
I
should.
think in some cases you end up with suppliers who are so desperate
Yeah.
to get the project
Get
underway.
everything going, yeah.
That's right.
That they figure that they can catch up with it all later. And with projects are very complicated animals. And if you start off weak, it's hard to fix it on the fly. And I think this is, but there's, really, when you look at that, when you look at the things that went wrong with those projects, almost everything was very predictable. I mean, some of it's hindsight, but not all of it. A lot of it was predictable. A lot of people predicted it. I talked to one utility that was looking at AP 1000, and when they saw that who was the team, they just said, nah. Yeah, that's all right. And I think you have to look at the teams. I mean, you have to look. You have the right people with the right expertise to be able to, because things are going to go wrong, right, on any major project. And the key is, do you have people have the experience and capability to make the adjustments on, as they go forward, to learn from the experience, and to be stronger and go forward. And the local summer projects, they really didn't have that until very recently. They're much more confident about it right now. But I think that even if you talk to Southern, they were always kind of watching this with a little bit of apprehension. Of course, because of the way the contract was structured, they couldn't do anything about it.
They couldn't even talk about it.
So I would add one thing to that, and that is there are some things that we can't do, and that is we cannot make our own plumbers, pipe fitters, and welders with 5 years' experience and say, poof, get on the job. And that is something that is a challenge throughout the entire region. We've got very low unemployment, construction industry even lower. And we need, starting in August, we need 1,000 of these people.
Yeah. Well, one would think that the salaries enough to support that.
We are paying a lot of money, a lot of bonuses. We are looking nationwide. And it's part of this, when you talk about the supply chain and the manufacturers, and we do a lot at this level on education, and we need lots of nuclear engineers. We also need the supporting structure underneath that. We need more robust apprenticeship programs.
One of the skill sets that is just almost non-existent in some places is the stainless steel welders. It's like you just can't find them.
We just finished a $4 billion LNG export facility. I guess we finished it right on time, on time and on budget. But now I understand there's more job openings than there are unemployed people in the United States.
Yes, there are.
For the first time in 30 years.
Yeah, it's basic, in these skills that we're looking for, it's basically zero unemployment. If they want a job, they have a job. And what's happening is we're starting to pull from other jobs, and we don't want to cannibalize other jobs. We want everybody's jobs to be able to go forward.
Got
It's
a
very
good crowd
challenging.
here that we could all, take some welding classes together.
I need 5 years' experience.
It's
Yeah, and we have the
Some will be on
apprenticeship
both.
programs, we max those out as best we can.
Yeah, I think this, this is a bigger issue. Maybe this is something that in Virginia you can think about overall, because, one of my biggest frustrations, because I go to lots of universities that give talks, and I talk to people who are doing educational activities, and one of my biggest frustration is that there's so many universities that issue these degrees that just don't mean anything, I mean, Janet's laughing because she knows
No, I'm
this
like,
is
don't,
what-
you don't, I don't know, you wanna go down this
I
stuff?
do.
Sorry.
You got July 7th.
I mean, you see these kids that graduate with these degrees in business communications or something like that, they can't get a job, they end up, doing, waiting tables and working in hair salons and things like that. What I wish we were able to do is to direct kids like that away from things like that and into apprenticeship programs. They learn how, I'd rather see them learn how to weld, stainless steel than learning business communications, which they'll never get.
Well, and they'll make a lot more money.
They'll make a lot more money. So why?
They won't have the debt and they'll make the money.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, someone will probably pay them to go get this training. And somehow we missed that connection, and I don't know. And I think that's a state level thing. I think at a state level, Virginia, you can take real action to really encourage kids to look at that as an option. But we've trained ourselves to say that university degrees are the answer to life. But what we're missing is not every university degree is worth having. It just isn't. I'm sorry, it's just not. And when I hear people say their kid's going to school and is going to get a bachelor's degree in archaeology, I say, well, okay, that's nice, but what are you going to do with that?
Take the welding class too.
Well, there's a community college I went to down in Lake Jackson, Texas, where the Texas Employment Commission and the petrochem industry and the community college, they all work really close together. And there's 100 welding machines in this community college, and the kids come off of the welfare rolls, and in 6 months they're making $50,000 a year in petrochem, and it's just a beautiful model.
They can make more than nuclear.
Texas actually, I was in Texas, Texas A&M got into, like, there's this whole web of high schools that are involved with the state supports for all kinds of vocational work, and also higher education stuff. I mean, Texas is pretty sophisticated, so you guys could probably go down to Texas and benchmark that and see what they're doing, and you might come back with some really interesting ideas. And I think they're doing some really great work there.
But they're also aggressive. I mean, they don't let an opportunity slip by them.
They're good, and they have the petrochemical industries, kind of a really good core. But the nuclear benefits from that, and a lot of other industries do as well. They also have aerospace, because they have a lot of stuff. So I think that's something that's worth it.
On engineers, I love taking one of my, I used to have a client up to the Hill, and they have an apprentice program, and love telling these kids on the Hill that are making $35,000 that a welder can make 6 figures easily, and these kids get these wide eyes and they just don't even understand, but there's such an opportunity.
It's a good a little bit of a segue to maybe a little bit of what April's going to update us on, because I know VNEC's been looking at helping create their energy workforce cluster in Virginia. The whole idea that's a state level initiative that brings that not only brings the nuclear industry, but it's all energy together, and both academics, both at the university level, but down and the State Department of Education, industry, because I know we all have programs that are training in our specific areas, but sometimes it's good to pull those in as well.
Can I actually ask Mr. Magwood a couple of questions? Excuse me, first of all, for my phone going off. My daughter gave me this thing and I haven't learned how to utilize it.
Can you tell us who you are and what group you represent? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm a citizen. I live here in Virginia. I'm a volunteer for the Sierra Club here in Virginia as well.
Okay.
I know you spent some time recently in Japan, and I've been following the Japanese accident for all these 7 years. And I went to your website for this Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that you're with. And so I'm curious on, has there been a time frame developed on how the removal of these 3 melted cores, is there any kind of time frame? Because I saw an interview with you 7 years ago after the accident, said it's going to be a very, very long, tedious, hard road. Is there any kind of time frame for removal of this melted cores, 3 of them?
Well, I think what the Japanese have tried to do is to establish a timeline for when they can start doing this, and they're aiming for actually for a relative near-term start, and they've developed the methodology they want to use to do it. But really, until you really get in and have a much clearer analysis of what things look like in there, like we're only guessing still really where the core material might be. So it's definitely decades. I don't think they try to put a time frame on it at this point, but it's certainly decades.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm curious because, you know, I'm old enough now to have gone through Chernobyl, through 3 Mile Island, and now Fukushima. And, I mean, we just finished building another sarcophagus for the, you know, for Chernobyl.
Right.
And that, as far as I know, that elephant foot is still in there. So, I mean, is it really something that's actually going to be able, that's going to be able to
Well, the
remove this fuel?
Japanese have been very clear about this. They fully intend to remove the material.
Okay.
And they've even started talking about where to put it afterwards. I mean, this, but it's a long-term
Right.
issue. And they've made a commitment to the people in Fukushima that they will remove all that material. But, you know, it's a huge challenge, and it's a big,
Right.
it's not just it's actually testing the limits of what we're able to do.
Well, I think that's the exact words you used in
Yeah.
that interview 7 years ago, that we don't even have the technology or the withal at this point yet
Yeah.
to be able to deal with this. I guess my other question is, I know that over time they've been storing in these huge containers the radioactive water where they're not able to remove the tritium. And the property, from the last pictures I've seen, it's just unbelievable how it's just covered the whole the whole facility, the whole all this landmass. And they keep threatening online. I keep seeing stories that they're going to dump the water. Are they actually going to dump the water?
Well, their regulator has basically been very clear about this. They think it's safe to release the water in a controlled fashion. Most of the water that is in storage has been stripped of things like strontium and cesium. You know, it's mostly tritium.
Right.
And you can safely release tritiated water in the ocean without causing human health effects. But that's not just a technical issue, it's a political one. And
Right,
it's a sociological one, because people have to feel that this is not going to create a problem down the road. But the regulators looked at this very carefully. They're confident you can release almost all the water. There's some water you can't release because it still has some other contaminants, but the tritiated water can be released safely.
So they are going to release it.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying the regulators said they can do it, and I think the IAEA has looked at it, and they said we can release it. Really, everyone internationally has looked at it says it can be released. We've actually said that as well.
So they'd be releasing it slowly, or just a big, huge dump, or
Oh, over time, yeah.
over time?
Yeah, you definitely want to have it diluted in an appropriate way. But again, it's tritiated. As long as you're talking about the tritiated water, I think most experts have concluded that you can do this. But it's not just a technical question. We have to see what kind of arrangements they're able to make with the public to make sure there's confidence that this will not cause problems down the road. And that's something we have to work through very carefully.
Right, and I have one more question, and thank you for allowing me this time. I read also on your website, the company you work with, the agency rather, that it was stated that about 50% of the radiation of what Chernobyl was released in Fukushima. So 50% of what was released, of the number out of Chernobyl. I'm just curious because I saw a diagram where you had the 4 reactors and supposable thinking where these fuel cores are melted. Was it just one of the reactors in a suppression chamber where there was a breach, and then in the pool, did all 4 of these, well, because obviously number 4 reactor wasn't really operational, but where were these breaches? Where did the breaches take place that allowed for 50% of the radiation to be emitted into the environment?
Well, I mean, the 50% is a comparison to Chernobyl.
Right.
In the case of Chernobyl, you had a facility that did not have a containment building.
Right.
And you had a graphite moderated core, so you had this thing catch fire and
Right.
it just released a lot of material into the atmosphere. These reactors at Fukushima Daiichi were all light water reactors, so they were all within containment, and the vast majority of the material was not released, but some did obviously get out in various forms, and most of the cesium, but there was lots of material that did escape. And I think some of it came from all the reactors. I don't think it was just from one. I think unit 1 was probably the most problematic, but I think there was some from all the damaged cores. But I mean,
so was there a breach in the containment structure itself? Was there a breach in the suppression chamber, or?
For two of them that we think there were, well, again, some of these questions are still yet to be answered, but for unit one, there certainly was a breach, both at the bottom and at the top, because
The explosion?
because they overpressurized the vessel. For some of the others, I think it just got out through some of the existing vents. I mean, these vents weren't filtered; they were just open vents, and so some material escaped.
Right. And I think that was one of the regulatory issues we were looking at in the United States. It was about the vents, and I think it was said, yes, we were, and then later they, I guess, pulled back and said.
No, we decided not to do
Right,
it.
because of cost.
Yeah.
And so the pool in Unit 4, have they removed all the
So-
fuel that was in there, correct?
Right, and now they're working on the other ones.
Okay, all right. I think that's all the questions I have, other than one last thing. I know we're talking about taking these reactors up to 80 years, and I know the NRC, because I follow it, are trying to come up with the regulations on what that means and what needs to be done. Obviously, when these reactors were built, the overall thinking was 40 years. And I have talked to other engineers before, and they said that, you can replace all these different parts, but the reactor vessel itself, and we know from what's going on around the country and around the world, that they start developing little fissures and whatnot. Are we really expecting these reactor vessels themselves to be able to be managed for 80 years?
Yes.
And the reason why? What's the thinking? Are we going to be able to coat them or do something to keep them from?
No, I mean, basically, many of the reactors have samples of material
Right.
that can be taken and analyzed to show that the pressure vessel materials are still, intact and still appropriate. I mean, there are reactors where we don't think that it can go that long. There's one reactor I mentioned in particular where there's been an analysis for some number of years because they think that the fluence was higher than expected, and therefore there might be a long-term embrittlement problem, not a problem today, but long-term, and that's a reactor that won't be operating for 80 years. So I think we understand this pretty well, and I think that you will find that the programs, it's not so much a change in regulation that they're looking at, it's really just gaining confidence on these issues like the material pressure vessel. And one correction I would say, I think that when you talk about the 40 years in the U.S. in particular, the 40 years was not a technical limitation. It was actually done more for financial purposes originally. It was a relatively arbitrary number. And so when we look at having these licenses extended, as long as the licensees can prove that they can maintain the safe condition of all the key components, and there are regulations, there's no reason why they can't continue to operate. They have to every 20 years they have to go for a new license extension. But if you can show that the material is in good shape, you have a program to show that you can make sure that the pressure vessel and other key materials or key components are maintainable at a safe level for that period of time, there's no issue.
Well, but I do understand that we've run out of the ability for some of these samples in the reactors that were originally set up, and so now we're using new material down there.
That's just one of the mechanisms used to show that.
And then I guess the other issue would
Wait,
be.
Erica, we're gonna have, sorry, we just have to move on to.
I know,
we'll
but I like
solve
having the
that.
professional. It's just one
I
last
agree.
question. One last question.
All right, one more
So
question.
none of our
The, I know I have a lot of questions because I don't have this kind of ability
That's
to have professional. Yeah, I want to hear what he has to say because I've been following Mr. Magwood's
Okay.
tenure through the Department of Energy and through the NRC and where he is now. So this is important, and I do appreciate the time. I think the issue would be I want to have confidence that these reactors are safe. And where I do have some issues is like here recently with Dominion getting a hardship on not having to check the cold leg when it's due to be checked because these pieces, these parts, have welds, and we know that they're probably in the long run more susceptible because they should be checked, but because of the hardship they get, they don't have to check it for 4 years. And then I do some more reading and I find that the hardships are where they don't have to check 100% of different components because they're too hard to get to, this, that, and the other, so they have to check 80%. and then or 88%, and then this goes on for, you know, decades. And then so it makes me wonder, if we're not able to see anywhere between 20 to 12% or so of different components over time, how can we be secure that these components are actually in good shape?
Well, I can't speak to the specific Dominion case you pointed out. I'm not familiar with the details of that. But, I mean, it is certainly the case that when the NRC is looking at how to verify the material condition of a particular component, they take into account lots of different considerations. And one is, you know, if you're going to expose people and give people a high dose to look at something that you can verify another way, you know, you can make an argument on that. And I think but the utilities always have to be able to give NRC very solid analysis, not just because it's hard. They have to give a solid analysis to show, here's why we think we can inspect this in the following way. And let me try to tell you, the NRC staff is very, very rigorous about this. I mean, I think that if anything, they're pretty conservative. And there's lots of people in the industry that will tell you that they get very frustrated because they come to the NRC with this very solid analysis. And the NRC says, well, you know, maybe you have these numbers to show this, but you know, I want to see this and this and this and this. And so I think the NRC staff is very conservative, and they don't give free breaks and free passes to the industry because they know they're responsible. They know that you know, if there were a nuclear accident, everyone would be looking at the NRC thinking, what in the world happened? How did you fail? So they're very conservative with these things. They're very careful. Everything's done on an analytical basis that is very, very well founded. And I mean, if anything, I just sort of conclude with this, that I think in the aftermath of Fukushima Daiichi, I think people in the NRC staff have even looked at how they think about potential for nuclear accidents. I think before what happened in Japan, they thought it was all kind of theoretical. And then after the accident, it became very much a now thing, a very personal thing that they all look at very closely. And so every decision they make, I think they have that filter in their minds. So if they're giving some kind of regulatory relief or special relief on a particular component, I'm pretty confident they've done it in a very professional and thorough way.
Thank you.